Hello, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us for another installment of our Red Hen Press reading and conversation series. I'm Monica Fernandez.
And I'm Toby Harper.
And we are so excited to bring this conversation to you this evening. We would like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which Toby and I are broadcasting from is the occupied and seized territory of the Gabrielino, Tongva, and Kizh people. In November of 2018, C-SPAN conducted an interview with Sarah Crown, an archivist at the Santa Monica History Museum, who spoke about the Tongva people, their culture, and their history in this region. Watch the archived clip after tonight's event. Tonight's special event features American Quasar, the newly released poetry and art hybrid collection. We're honored to welcome the creators, poet David Campos and artist Maceo Montoya, who worked together to create this beautiful collection. Welcome, David.
Hi.
And Maceo. Hi. We're so excited for this event tonight, which is actually the last one in our Hen House at Home Spring series. I think you'll get started with some brief readings and a slideshow before the two of you launch into your conversation, right?
Absolutely.
All right, great. We are looking forward to it. So Toby and I are going to hop off. We'll see you at the end of the show.
See you there.
Awesome. So I'm going to start with reading 3 poems from American Quasar. And I thought it would be perfect to read one, the first poem, a last poem, and one from somewhere in between. So let's start off with American House Fire. In a house fire, you don't die from the flames. So don't mind the broken windows. I'm trying to let the smoke out. I have been for a long time running from room to room looking for an exit. What I would give for the chill of starlight, to believe in a just God who brings rain to temper the blaze ravaging my house, to feel for once what it's like to win. In victory, instinct orders our arms to rise toward the heavens. Some say this is what we're left with to remind us of God, to remind us to surrender. But the smoke has stolen too many of our fathers. It is after our sons. And every door leads to another dead dream's room. Still they watch my house burn, smoke lifting its arms over the city. Only if they didn't cook with fire, they say. Only if their house had followed code. How many more doors will have to burn until it's yours? I'm running out of windows, and my arms are losing their strength. The sky darkens with victory. Surrender? It's hard to tell anymore. But what's certain is, in a house fire, you die when you cry your child's name. American Boy. I dream myself young, running to adore the sky's color. I'm white. Instead of myself, I wonder where all the blues went. They're not in the broken record player. The needle only plays songs of crushed bone. I want to call out the sky's real name, even though my tongue has been sanded down from years of hushing my own. And I can't shake the tongueless boy, knowing I will never grasp how to love myself in color. Finally, something like the color of faith. Each sunrise is a church. Yesterday morning, alcohol dripped from my breath. A bead of sweat from a woman's brow teetered on my shoulder, the warmth of her lips leaving my neck. The sun so bright I confused this for love. I bought her flowers, an arrangement, the intelligent colors of spring, had them delivered to her work, left a note to remind her of the way she held my throat and squeezed, how it made me laugh. not in the way three people walk into a bar, but in the way death appears when a life is taken and says, I need a place to stay. But this madrugada, I drive into the farmlands again to teach the making of a sentence. Where I think I'm certain what constitutes a complete thought. Perhaps I believe it the way my students do when I draw it out on the whiteboard. Blue marker, red marker, purple noun, green verb, the bright sun over the valley, yellow, no, gold, no, something like the color of faith. I roll down my windows, smell the manure, and believe in the education of the wind rushing past me. A skydiver right before the jump, right before I say I love you again. Remember how loud it is to give all of yourself. When I say it, I understand what it means to pray. I'll hand it over to Maceo.
Wow, David, what a powerful reading. And, it just reminds me like where this project began. And, you have so much of Andres's spirit, so much of his energy, his presence, even as I hear your voice. And of course, I'm speaking of my brother, Andres Montoya. And you won your first collection. You were the winner of the Andres Montoya Poetry Prize in 2014. My brother Andres, a poet from Fresno who died of leukemia in 1999. And, one of the things that I wish the world could see, because they continue to read his poetry and to read his words on the page, but to actually to have been there to hear his voice. And I feel like just listening to you now, there's so much of his presence in you, and it's incredible to hear. And that was very moving, and it even caught me off guard, just because I've read through this manuscript so many times over the years, and yet it reminded me of why we had such a connection when we began working, and a lot of that came from its initial source, the origin of bonding over Andres, bonding over Fresno, bonding over this shared language that we have. And the project started with Francisco Aragon, who's the director of Letras Latinas at the University of Notre Dame. He's the steward, the founder of the Andres Montoya Poetry Prize. And he's always kind of looking for new initiatives and new ways of fundraising. And so he asked me if I wouldn't want to work with a poet to create a print. And my dad had created a print based on Andres's poetry, my dad Malaquias Montoya, a number of years ago, and that was used to raise funds to publish the book, to promote the book, so he charged us with doing the same. And I think that Francisco had in mind that we would produce one print or a suite of prints, and I don't think that he thought 5 years later, we would be presenting this book to the world. But I just wanted to walk through like a couple of the early images that we were working with, and then how it turned from just working on a print for this fundraiser to American Quasar, the book that we have here that we're talking about today. So this is actually, sorry to put you on the spot, David, but I asked David, we were working with this theme. We were kind of going back and forth with this idea of the precipice of violence. And I actually, my painting is actually on the cover of David's first book, Furious Dusk. and there's like a fight scene. These soccer players in the middle of a field. There's a haystack in the background. There's a scene of violence, and I think that we were kind of thinking through that and this idea of the precipice of violence. And so I asked David. I said, "Can you send me a picture where you're pretending to punch the ground?" And you didn't ask why. You just sent me an image, and so I worked with that. And so the next slide will show the charcoal drawing that I came up with. And I don't know. It was a sketch, working through an idea, and wasn't entirely happy with it, but I sent it to you. How can we work with this? And you actually were working on a poem, and you layered over some of the lines, just kind of, as like a graphic designer. And that's the next slide. So this is a line from the first poem that you wrote, which was, I think it was titled "The Precipice of Violence." And this was, "I will stab your eyes to stop the dreaming." And I think we could have worked with this. And yet at the time I had just, my dad's mentor, Joseph Zerker, incredible printmaker, is in his 90s, and he had told me that if you could come pick up this etching press in Palo Alto, which is about 2 hours away, the etching press is yours. And so I figured out how to go and pick up this gigantic, heavy etching press, and I had it in my studio, and I wanted to work with it. And so I decided to do this series of monoprints where I'm inking up the plate, wiping away to kind of find the white on the paper. And I looked back at David's poem and started to see all the imagery that was emerging. So if you show the next slide, it's David's first poem that he sent to me. On one knee, I'll reach into my pocket. The stone doesn't come that way. It's cut. Its tattered remains, a slice of forgotten stars in the night sky. Soon I will stab your eyes to stop the dreaming. And the first was, on one knee, I'll reach into my pocket. I dug into the plate to find that image. That's the next slide. You can go on to the next slide. This one, it's tattered remains. And this was actually another photo that David had sent, which was a close-up of him. And I wasn't necessarily trying to go for his portrait. I like wiped away. It felt like it kind of captured the tattered remains, the flesh on a skull, on a head. I'm going to the next slide. And this one, this is a question I want to ask you in a bit, David, about the presence of the sky, the presence of the celestial. And this line, a slice of forgotten stars in the night sky, right? And this is what I think that you can do in poetry, right? How can there be a night sky? And what was so kind of energizing as an artist is to try and kind of capture that energy, capture that image there on the plate. And this was perfect because as I was able to scrape away with the palette knife, it felt like I was creating this night sky. And the next slide. Soon I will stab your eyes to stop the dreaming. Just working through that, this kind of faceless, eyeless face. And the next slide. And this one, this was the pieces I ended up just pulling the language, and the titles to this day are the lines from the poem. And this one is the shadow's implicit desire for light. And the images, they have this. When you're working on the plate, you're kind of having to work backwards. What's going to emerge? And in that poem, Toby, if you can just go back to the previous image, how instead of a shadow that this figure is casting, the figure is actually casting light. And I felt like it kind of captured that shadow's implicit desire for light. The shadow itself has a light to it. And then I sent these to you. Right. And so one poem inspired these 5 images. And right. Then I think that you took those, and then Toby, you can go on to the next slide. And ideas that started to come from that. And so you took a slice of forgotten stars in the night sky. Why have I hidden them for so long? And then from its tattered remains, you have taken my mouth, and now I speak in glances my mother has given me. In church, the communion goes uneaten. And there's an image that emerged from that line. In church, the communion goes uneaten. There is no tongue to taste salvation. There's another image that emerged from that. And so back and forth we started to go. And I feel like from this, it really began to explode. I think I was the one who suggested, maybe instead of a fundraiser, we actually have a book here. And so I don't know if I, taking credit for having the first idea, but this was your response. Book, man, what a thought. I like it. Let's see where it takes us. And so here it is, 5 years later. And David, it's been such an amazing journey, such a generative journey to work with you on this project.
Wow. That kind of threw me for a loop. I hadn't seen those emails and that original poem in such a long time. Like there are somewhat like ghost versions of that poem, that first initial poem, all over the book now, because they've been revised and edited so much. But just really putting the text of those emails there and those original lines kind of like threw me back for a loop. I wasn't expecting that, but thank you for bringing that original, spark of creation to my attention and to everyone's attention watching us today. Right. So to start off and kick off this conversation and thinking about those revisions, like where we started and where we're at now, the poems evolved over time through revisions and edits. And sometimes they did so drastically, like that first original poem is in pieces all over throughout the book. Why do you think the images still resonate with the writing?
It's a great question, because I feel like it's one of those like it's so difficult to explain, and yet I can feel it, right? I can feel the imagery and I can feel the poetry, but how do I explain why they still can go together when the lines that inspire them are gone, right? Are edited out or in such a different fashion, repurposed throughout. And I was actually, you're asking me what my favorite poem was, and I have so many, but I was actually looking for that original poem, I guess forgetting or not realizing like it's no longer there, right? Those lines have appeared elsewhere. Some of the lines are gone. And, I feel like, so the elements of a poem, I feel like there's the inspiration, right? Like where you started with the idea. I think that there's obviously the language that you continue to kind of shape. And you're looking for a core of the poem, right? Where is that core going to come from? And a lot of it does. It comes from shaping the language, fine tuning the imagery. And at some point you almost kind of return to like that initial spark, that inspiration. And I feel like my images kind of touch upon, all three. And there is the element of the language that I'm drawing from. There's the imagery, obviously. There's the inspiration, but there's that core, that energy that maybe never goes away. Right? It's there from the beginning. Right. You continue to search for it and shape it, and you find that final version. Over you revise these for years, and yet those images were completed, long before.
Right.
My process was much faster than yours in a way. And yet I think that you can remove the line that inspired the piece, the image, and yet it can still resonate, because it's not like I'm tapping into this kind of one-to-one direct correlation to the poetry. I'm not illustrating it. I'm like seeking something deeper that you were after as well. Very cool. Yeah. So I guess my question kind of following that is, as we mentioned before, this project kind of was like an explosion of creative energy. It was so exciting to work on and to send you images and then have you send me 10 poems back. And at one point, I think a draft of this manuscript was 30 of my images and like 70 of your poems. And we had 100-page manuscript that we were passing around. And there was like an early reader had a very insightful criticism that felt like that together the images and the poetry like lacked intentionality, right? That they wanted to see more kind of this purposeful intention behind why they're together. And it made a lot of sense because obviously as artist and writer, we understood like where they came from, like why they belong together. But we needed to make it clear to the reader or to the viewer why these images had to go together, why they belong together. And so I'm curious what you thought of that process of finding the intentionality and revising the manuscript so that it's kind of refined form today compared to that explosion of energy that first manuscript was.
So I think there were two approaches, right? The first approach was to the poems themselves, and then the second approach was how to put the poems and the images together, how to pair them up, how to create a sense of order from them. And so the first one was for the poems. And, like from my revisions after those initial readings, it went through several different phases of revision. And I think for me, initially, based on that feedback, I was really trying to figure out, okay, what do I really want to say with this book? And I feel like that first reader didn't get it. And I was like, what am I doing wrong in order for that reader not necessarily to get it? And so I was going through different ideas, right? And trying out different ideas and different argumentative strategies and in order to evoke that larger idea, that larger intention, right? Be very clear with what my intention was from the beginning. And that is, I think, one of the primary reasons why that initial poem that I sent you, right, that was in a few sections was broken up, because I believe one of the direct comments was, this feels like this is a beginning poem for each individual section, right, for a section of the book. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. Let me explore that, right? So I think for me, it was always about exploring the possibilities of what my intention is, right? What my intention was, in order to finally get to where I think I was just like, oh, let's connect it back to the spark. What really initiated that spark? What was in that spark of creation that I can go back to, and what is my intention? How can I connect those two? And it was through those revisions that I was able to finally see, okay, this is what happens. And unfortunately, a lot of those lines, right, that initially created some of those images or inspired some of those images had to be removed. But because the intention was a lot clearer now that you talk about that, right, the images and the writing still resonate because that intention is clear. And so once I had that, right, then it was trying to figure out how to pair them up. And I think this was one of the most difficult aspects for me, right, because and correct me if I'm wrong, right, you're just like, show me an order, and I was like, okay, I'm gonna cut stuff. I hope Maceo doesn't yell at me for saying, hey, maybe we shouldn't have this print or this print or this print. And I started to really think about what was going on and what was going on in each individual poem and how I wanted to create a larger narrative arc. Originally, it was in like 4 or 5 sections. Then it came down into 2, and then it was starting to meld together. And I wanted to make sure that the images either were somewhat directly related to a poem in between them, or somewhat directly related to an emotional appeal that a series of poems was making, right? And sometimes the image will pair up directly, and sometimes it won't. And you may be wondering why. And there is a larger, I think, emotional connection that I saw there that really connected to the writing and to the overall narrative arc.
Yeah, I think that there was 30 prints total, but 19 made it into the book. And we felt, I think you shared like someone was reading it in front of you. And like when they read the poem and then they turned the page and they got to the image and like they gasped, right? And that was like the effect that we wanted. And, not every image needed to be there. It was more about how can we select the right image so that when someone finishes the poem and they turn the page or they look at the image facing the language, there's that feeling, that expectation that it should be there, right? And that's how I kind of understood the intentionality, is that we're not just throwing the images and the poetry together, but like there is this this arc that's involved, and a story that we're trying to tell, and that as a poem finishes and there's the image that's there, that there's this kind of synergy that's going on.
One thing that really helped me in the revision process, and it really came from talking about the process that you were going through, right? So in a video now that we've created, you talk about a ghosting image with the prints, right? Could you explain that and describe what inspired this concept?
Yeah. So the ghost image is pretty common in printmaking. You ink up the plate and you run it through the press, and it takes most of the ink off, but there's always the ghost of the image that remains. And I was working just on inking up plexiglass, running it through, and it takes most of the ink off. But there was always like some kind of ghost of the image that was there. And I would either run it through completely again or try to incorporate it into another image. And sometimes I like that effect even more. And there's the image where there's a face kind of emerging through haze, emerging through smoke. And that was a ghost image where the face still was on the plate. And when I started inking it up, I thought, God, that resonates with your poem, American House Fire. And, someone kind of emerging through that dark cloud of smoke. There was also the aspect of digging away at the plate. And so this doesn't have to do with the ghost of the image, but I shared with you my process of I'm covering the plexiglass in ink. I'm digging away. I'm using rags. I'm using my fingers. I'm using the palette knife. I'm using whatever I can to create these different effects. And I remember you got very excited about that because there was two parts of the process, right? Utilizing a ghost image, and then the kind of digging away, the excavating, the finding an image through the layers of paint. And I remember you wanting to incorporate that into the poetry. So I'm curious, like how did you understand that represented in the language?
So in the language, I was really fascinated by this idea that you can have one, like an image underneath something, maybe something that recalls something that happened before, right? And so because the work is very introspective, right? I wanted to really find a way to represent that on the page. And the way that you described that process was just like, okay, I wonder if I could do that with a poem. So for example, this is why you will have American House Fire, right? Which opens the book. And then you will have American House Fire 2, which is on page 41, right? And in both of those poems, you will see similar lines, similar language, similar structures, but there's a turn, there's something different. There's something that has changed between that first original image and the second. The same with American Boy and American Boy 2, right? There's something in both of those poems that are similar, but there's slight changes. There's a different direction. There's a new discovery from the original structure. And it all came about from talking about this process of, ghosting the image. And there are others in places in the book where you'll read a line and the whole intention was for a reader to come across and be like, wait, didn't didn't I just read that? Right? Like, wait, but this is different. Is this a glitch in the matrix? What's going on? Right? And when you look at the images, right, you will begin to see those ghosted images in the background. And so for someone who's paying attention and looking closely at what's going on with the poetry and the art, right, there's that different layer there for them as well.
Yeah, yeah. You know, I was thinking, one of the things I most enjoyed was, like there was a poem, "The Letter to the Young Astronomer," and it, it kind of lent itself to me, like working on the skies, right? And so I was creating these like starscapes, these the sky falling, the like digging into the ink, right? That this is this night sky and I'm creating this I don't know, something celestial from it. And there is this whole element, including, the name of the book is American Quasar,
Right.
Where you talk about the celestial. And I'm wondering where that came from, especially because I feel like your first collection, and when I think of you, like rooted in Fresno and this whole kind of, wonderful like school community of Fresno poets. And I identify your work kind of rooted firmly in place. And yet here there is like this whole conversation with the beyond, with the outer space, with other galaxies, and I've always been kind of curious about that. From my artist perspective, it was just, I had the easy part of it, just fun digging into the ink, making stars.
So I turned to that page in the book, right? And when I was thinking about, like, one thing about Fresno is you're in the Central Valley. The smog is not as bad as it could be in LA and some of the major cities, but you do get that forever haze. And I think for me as a young boy, like going out to the mountains for the first time and really seeing like, oh snap, like there are stars out here, right? So beyond the city, right, beyond what I know, there is so much more that I have never seen before, right? And so that goes back to what you were talking about, like this forgotten slice of stars, right? Forgotten piece of sky, right? That's what I'm talking about. I was like, it was never really mentioned to me, right? It was never really shown to me. And I was like, okay, this is an act of discovery, right? So beyond your city and love, out there in the unfathomable cold, the brightest stars burn with frostbite, right? Like that. That opening stanza is just like a call to this idea of what is going on in this particular poem. But Quasar came about, and this idea of the stars came about because I was really interested, and I am not an astronomer, I am not a scientist by any, right? So I could be radically wrong, but my first initial thought was there was some new discoveries in the news about black holes and black holes at the center of our galaxies. And the one at ours is, I believe it's called Sagittarius A. And one thing that was really interesting was that some of them are active. They are consuming the galaxy that they are a center of. And some of them are active, meaning that they are spewing funnels in both directions. And there was a theory that I was reading that not only is it destructive, but it is also generative, because all that material that's being spewed out is going to collect, condense, create new planets, create new stars. And I was thinking this is a very interesting concept, because as I was writing and revising through this book, I realized that there was one particular section, one kind of larger idea being bounced off this second idea, right? And so this is why the first one is American House Fire and the second one is Quasars. American House Fire, is dealing more with like these larger political ideas, and then the second one is reckoning that with the personal. And that's the approach that I had it when I was thinking about the stars and figuring out what was going on here. I was trying to in a way, discover the sky, and make it feel like to the reader and to everyone else what it felt like for me that first time, heading up to the mountains and like, oh snap, there's a whole world out here.
Yeah. It's interesting. I'm thinking of one of the image, and I can't think of the line. It's like, but there's a figure digging into the earth looking for the stars. And I feel like there is that play between one being trapped, right, in one's situation, one's conditions, kind of being chained to the ground, and yet this kind of desperate need to break out of that, right? And whether one finds the stars kind of digging through the earth or not, there's still that desire that's there. And I think that as kind of energizing as it was to kind of think of the celestial and to incorporate that into the work, what drew me to your poetry, both your first collection and this one, is its kind of emotional core. And the emotional core as a Chicano, as a man, as someone from Fresno, as as a son, there's poems that deal with that. And so I'm kind of curious, just like, how you navigate this kind of abstract quality of your work, and then this desire to kind of have it more concrete, to have it rooted in place and speaking to a certain political moment or.
I think that just comes from my own practice and craft and education of poetry. Everyone has their own particular path to where they write, and mine at first was all over the place, right? Like as many young writers are, and then they are shaped by who they read, who they study with, whose advice they take, what they read, right? What ideas takes hold and center for them. And for me, one of them was concrete poetry, right? Thinking about concrete images, working with strong images. And secondarily, in graduate school, I really started to focus on how to evoke deep emotions or emotional core, how to discover that through the writing itself, and how to refocus it in order to evoke that in my reader and in my poems. And that involved a lot of reading, a lot of work, a lot of really understanding the way that language works, not just as a word, but as an image, right? So when we read something, we don't necessarily read, red hen press, right? It's just these kind of like images that pop into our minds. I mean, many of us have seen, there's this meme paragraph. It's all misspelled, but you could read it like clean as day, right? Because your brain doesn't read the word themselves. It reads like this larger image and it makes sense of it. And I was just like, okay, how can I do that? How can I rework my poems and still work with these larger abstract ideas, but center it in concrete images, center it with images that are personal, center it with images and experiences that may seem mundane to some folks, but can have the opportunity to explore those larger ideas.
Yeah, no, and I feel like we both come from the Chicano literary and cultural artistic tradition, and I think that a lot of that artwork, a lot of that poetry, the message is very clear, and I find in my work for maybe the last 10 years this kind of struggle with what kind of work do I make if it's not focused on a message, if it's not focused on kind of giving light to stories that are overlooked or that aren't told. And what would I create kind of alone in my studio? That's a question that I often ask myself. And I'm grateful to you and I'm grateful to this project because I felt like I was able to explore my own imagery through your imagery. And it was, some of it can be very abstract. Some of it can be about the heavens, about the sky, about the quasars, about all of these things that I wouldn't necessarily venture into. And yet I still feel like when I look at that work, it's very concrete. There is this emotional core that still speaks to my experience, to your experience, and that it is, firmly on the ground. And yet I may not have ventured there on my own. And I think that that's what was so exciting about this collaborative process is the ability to kind of borrow freely from one another to kind of overcome these obstacles that we might have in our craft, in our process.
So, speaking of which, right, like you created a lot, and because of that, I kind of want to know, based off this creative process and all this kind of large generative spark that we had at the beginning, thinking back on all of that and having kind of, I had no idea, right? Like this is something that you were struggling with, or at least thinking about. Which one then is your favorite image that came out of this project? That really kind of opened it up for you, right? Like, oh, like this is possible. I haven't really thought of this, right? This doesn't necessarily have a political message, right? Like this is something new. This is something personal.
Yeah. There was the image where the figure is looking back, the shadow's implicit desire for light. And I think that's one of my favorite images. Again, because it is centered on the human figure, but it's no one in particular. It was kind of this recognition that, you can just kind of, by searching there on the page or on the plate as wiping away, and that you can kind of rely on that intuition to kind of discover meaning, to discover, this emotional core. And there's just aesthetically, I guess I like the image, the sharpness of the image. But I remember thinking, this is a breakthrough of sorts, because just a recognition of a power within yourself that you can't really articulate, right? But then there it appears, and it appeared so simply. That image is almost entirely black. You can see exactly the couple wipes away with the rag, and then there it was. Right. And when something comes together, so simply, right, just with a few marks of a rag on a plate, you feel like that was already kind of fully constructed inside of you. And I guess, you mentioned a struggle or a question, and it's definitely a struggle. It's definitely something that I feel like I keep returning to in the studio. And yet, here that image, emerged through that tension, through that struggle.
We're seeing them in a book, but how big are the original prints?
So the paper itself is 22 by 30. Yeah. So they're obviously they're bigger than what than how they appear in the book. And they're also, I think they're much, the black of the ink is more apparent in the original prints. Yeah. How about you? Do you have a favorite image?
I did, and I remember because I had no idea that it was a portrait of myself. Right? But I remember going to your studio, and you had them all laid out on these tables, and you asked me, right? I was working on my handwriting, and you asked me, it's terrible handwriting, but and you asked me, which one is your favorite image? And I pointed to one, and it's the kind of face profile with the like mouth and kind of like jaw wiped out and white.
Yeah. It's Tattered Remains. Yeah.
Right. And you're like, it's funny that you say that, right? Because it's a portrait of you. And I was just like, what? But that still remains, I think, to me, one of my favorite images, because I feel like one of the things that I talk about in this particular book, right, even in American Boy, it's like a tongueless, right? How someone who hushes their own name, who feels like they have no mouth to speak with, right? And it really captures, I think, this larger frustration that was embedded into a lot of the poems in this collection.
Yeah.
And it was just like, that's the image. That's the image for me.
Yeah. And it was like intuitive. I feel like the portrait wasn't coming out looking like you, which is why you didn't recognize yourself. And so just in frustration, I was just like, and I wiped it away. And then it was like, that was the effect. And, and this is because I'm also a fiction writer. But I feel like as an artist, I connect more with poets because there is this kind of intuitive search, right? And where it is largely about kind of play or just working through just how things are arranged or the substance itself, right? And there was no intention behind that. It's just something that I followed, and then for you, it kind of captured this meaning that you were after in your poetry. So I want to ask you, David, and this kind of brings it back to Andres, my brother, and we were sitting in the Tower District in Fresno at a coffee shop, and I think I was showing him like my sketchbook, and he commented, he said that any artist can depict despair. What's harder to do is to depict hope. And I feel like there is a lot of despair in this work. There is a lot of despair in the imagery as well. But I also believe that there's a lot of hope in each poem, and there's a lot of hope in the imagery. And I'm wondering how where you see the hope in this collection.
I see it mostly in the second part, in Quasars. And the first one is all about like, this house is on fire. What can I salvage? And the second one is about both like, hey, you are being destroyed, right? But there's also an opportunity here for a new life, right? And this is where you see American House Fire 2, where you see American Boy 2, right? Like where you see like, okay, there are turns to things and topics that were discussed previously, but now there's a new spin to them. Now there's a new light to them. And I think that's kind of where I was headed towards, right? This larger hope towards the end. Even the one that you talk about, and you brought up earlier, Letter to a Young Astronomer, is all about being able to see all of that love, being able to see everything that his city, that himself, that his world is surrounded with. And when I talk about that that closing poem, right? When I say it, I understand what it means to pray, right? It's just like, here's that hope, right? That I'm able to love again, that confronting the world, confronting everything that exists around us, and doing so, right? I think there is an inherent hope that is a part of it. And that's what I was really trying to portray. And so, yeah, there is a lot of despair in the book. There is a lot of like, oh my God, what is going on here? But my intention was to lead to a door of possibility, because hope doesn't necessarily happen for everyone, right? Or at least those opportunities for hope don't necessarily happen for everyone. And so I just wanted to leave it as a possibility that something can do that. And it is something that I also struggle with, right? Like, I'm working through the next manuscript right now. And I'm clearly thinking about that myself. I'm like, okay, that's pretty dark. David, how can I pivot this and provide not just levity, but a bit of light, right? So, most of the screen prints were here was discovering light. Now, what would it be like if I really let that light overtake the images? That's kind of the struggle where I am right now.
Yeah. So, when we when the manuscript was picked up by Red Hen Press, we were really excited, and then they told us it was going to be like about 3 years before the book came out. we still wanted to go forward. And I remember we kind of joked, like, our lives in 3 years can be completely different. And none of us could have predicted that the month that the book came out, you would also have your first child, a daughter.
Mm-hmm.
So first of all, congratulations.
Thank you.
But I'm curious, what's that like, having this book and then your daughter come into the world at the same time?
It's overwhelming. I am tired. Today I took a very extra long nap, which was really nice. But it's kind of like, some of us believe in fate, right? And maybe it's just coincidence, but it's just like two great things entering the larger world at once. And for me, that means, something for me personally. Whether it has any real resonance beyond that, I don't know. But I'm just really excited and really happy that it worked out this way.
Yeah.
And so you were talking about hope earlier. I'm like, that's a lot of hope right there.
Yeah. All right. Well, congratulations again. And David, I really mean it. It's been a wonderful journey, and I'm grateful to you, to your work, to your poetry. I've enjoyed this process and this conversation especially.
Oh man, thank you, Maceo, for everything. Right. So, I mean, you're the one who came up with the idea. You welcomed me into your home. You showed me you allowed me to modify some of the art. This whole process has been very eye-opening, and I'm forever grateful and thankful for that. Thank you, Maceo, and thank you for everyone else for joining us today. Helping us share the process of what American Quasar was and how it came to be.
Thank you so much. This was incredible.
So much. I loved this conversation. It was so fascinating to hear about how everything started and how everything influenced each other. So thank you both for sharing and spending so much time to kind of just make sure that this was such a great and organic conversation. So thank you guys so much. We'll see you next time.
Yeah, see you after the show. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. Don't forget, you can pick up the new American Quasar at the link in the chat, and you can get 30% off with the promo code HenHouseAtHome. That was our last event for our Hen House at Home spring season, but we are back next week for the final installment of our NEH Poetry Reading and Lecture Series featuring Douglas Manuel, Ron Kirchie, and Jason Schneiderman, who will be moderating. Thank you again for joining us tonight, and we'll see you next week.
Bye.